Well, this is Chris Billhart. I think this is Chris Billhart, everyone. I think that Peg is having trouble with her sound, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. And maybe Peg can join when she's got that figured out. So welcome to today's webinar. I'm really excited to talk with you all about mobile advocacy today for two reasons. One is that I know mobile advocacy is one of the most effective ways that I know of to enhance the effectiveness of our advocacy with domestic and sexual violence survivors. So it's one of my favorite topics. And the second reason is that I've gotten to work with my amazing co-presenter, Patricia Moen from Casa de Esperanza, who she'll be introducing herself and telling you a little bit more about Casa in just a moment. But it's been great to work with her as we develop the presentation that we're going to be delivering to you today. Okay, and I think, Miriam, can you advance the slide? Thank you. Okay, so I'll let Patricia introduce herself, as I said, but I am Chris Billhart, and I'm NASH's Technical Assistance Specialist, and NASH is the National Alliance for Safe Housing. And for those of you who might be new to NASH, in case any of you haven't attended one of our webinars or seen any of our materials or trainings yet, NASH is a project of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, which is a local program in Washington, D.C. that does lots of amazing, innovative housing services for survivors. And NASH was launched as a technical assistance and training provider almost 3 years ago now. And we've been going strong ever since then and plan to continue. We have a couple of project partners, state-level project partners, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who many of you have probably heard about. They've been doing lots of work in domestic violence and housing first for a long time. And the District of Columbia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who is also just a wonderful partner to have in this work. NASH is one of the four partners in the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about the consortium towards the end of today's presentation. Next slide. Great. Well, somehow our logo fell off the slide, but NASH, as we're doing here today with this webinar, we're really trying to help communities and both the victim services field and the homeless housing field to work towards increasing the housing options available to survivors of domestic and sexual violence so that they can avoid homelessness in their attempts to live safely. And I'm going to now turn it over to Patricia to introduce herself and Casa de Esperanza.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Patricia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So thank you for having me on this webinar, and welcome everyone. It's nice to see all of the names and where you're from and some familiar names as well. I work with Casa de Esperanza. I've had the great privilege of working with Casa Esperanza for the last 16 years. I've really come up here at the organization, starting in our family advocacy initiative, learning from day one as an advocate about mobile advocacy, what we've always called community-based advocacy, and have grown through the years doing all kinds of different things. My role currently is Chief Operating Officer, so responsible for a little bit of everything. Our mission is to mobilize Latinas and Latino communities to end domestic violence. We operate from a real strengths-based perspective, working on lifting up the values of Latino communities and using them as a foundation for building community-driven solutions. Our work centralizes building community capacity, so really engaging anyone who's interested in learning about domestic violence and sexual assault and how they can take action either in their personal life as a survivor or someone who's experiencing violence in the moment through service providers and folks like you who are looking to try something new or do something a little bit differently. Our three main work areas forward our mission and our goals. We have the Family Advocacy Initiative, where we work on the ground here in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the surrounding areas. We have a domestic violence shelter, our community-based advocacy, mobile advocacy work, and some advocates who are kind of in systems all the time, available to support Latinas and Latino families when they access those systems. We have community engagement, which is building capacity and leadership and supporting folks to take action in ways that make sense to them, which is really exciting. We work with men, women, and youth in that area. And then we have the National Latino Network for Healthy Families and Communities, which the organization since 2011 has been designated the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence in Latino Communities. So through that work, we provide training and technical assistance like this, and research, and we conduct original research and do policy advocacy as well at the national level.
Okay, back to me. And Patricia and I are going to be handing the mic back and forth today, so you'll hear our different voices as we go through. In terms of what we plan to cover today, we hope there's something for everyone. We know that there's likely a range of experience with mobile advocacy and that approach in general among you. And I'm sure that some of you are very deeply committed to it, and some of you are not so sure, and some may be brand new to it. So we'll first look at mobile advocacy's underpinnings and foundations, and then describe what it can look like, some of the forms that it might take. Next, we'll look at the how-to of it, putting it into practice and ensuring that mobile advocates have the support that they need. And we'll wrap up by talking a bit about what we're learning about its effectiveness and its impact on survivors' abilities to meet their goals. Back to Patricia.
Thanks. So what is mobile advocacy anyway? Really, it is just leaving our offices and meeting participants where they are, where they feel comfortable, where it is convenient, and just getting out and going to them. So it's a very natural way to respond to participants' realities and their concerns as they state them. It's an approach that can really be a powerful tool for advocacy organizations to increase access to supports and reduce barriers and build trust and authentic relationships with survivors. We can go to the next slide. As I said, in my experience here at Casa Esperanza, it's broadly used in culturally specific communities and organizations. The promotora model that comes out of Latin America is a very culturally sensitive approach to training individuals to go out and be in community and support people in community in all kinds of different ways, where you don't necessarily have to be a licensed or highly trained professional, but you have enough information and resources and training to be able to support someone where they are with a limited scope of services, right? But there's lots of documentation around the effectiveness of the promotora model in the public health sector. So it's also really, and you can advance to the next slide, this is also an approach that is really grounded in the roots of the movement. Our movement started with individuals helping other individuals, our friends and our families, people that we knew in the neighborhood that were experiencing these struggles at home, and meeting for coffee around kitchen tables and dreaming up what we could do about it collectively as a community. So this approach is really, really true to the foundations of the movement. At Casa Esperanza, we like to think about creating spaces where people can connect at a real human and authentic level. And mobile advocacy really helps us do that and be able to be available and accessible to people in ways that we wouldn't be able to be otherwise. And we've found that it really supports and honors the dignity of participants in ways that office-based appointments don't necessarily support all of the time. We can go to the next slide. Other philosophical foundations to consider are the anti-oppression frameworks within which we can work. The movement itself was founded on a lot of deep roots in feminist thinking and anti-sexism, largely from a heteronormative perspective, right? But there have always been and continue to be groups who are excluded from the development of the movement and the systems that have evolved from the foundations of the movement. So while a lot of work has been done and continues to happen to shift this reality and move voices and experiences of diverse communities more to the center of the work, we have to continue to challenge the assumptions and paradigms that have informed the policies and procedures within which we operate. And mobile advocacy really is an opportunity to reevaluate policies and practices to see if they still fit, who they were designed for, and what they actually do for us in our daily work, for advocates and for survivors alike. So it's a highly individualized approach to providing support to survivors that can really take advocacy a lot further. We can move to the next slide. One of the things that has been really helpful to integrate into our thinking is the philosophy of the last girl, or the theory of the last girl, that came out of APNI-AP. And APNI-AP is an organization that was founded by 22 women in Mumbai's red light district in 2002. And the first cohort of Novo Foundation Move to End Violence movement makers went to India and met with the women who founded APNI-AP, including Ruchira Gupta. And the women there shared this theory of the last girl as a way to challenge all of the leaders of the domestic violence movement from the United States who had come to learn to look at who are the people that are not hearing your message, who are the people who are not being served. And if you can identify that last girl who is the least likely to know that our services and supports even exist, if you can reach her and support her, then you will have helped everyone else along the way. So the movement makers from Novo's cohort came back with this idea and have really been working to integrate it into a lot of their work in building communities and moving margin to center in all of the work that they've been doing to support the movement. So why mobile advocacy? I've mentioned this already. It can help eliminate barriers and increase access. It fosters more authentic human connections and provides unique opportunities to understand the participant's life. And we'll get into some of those in a little more detail later. So we hope to provide both kind of the high-level theoretical, why is this important, and then some practical, what does this mean for your initiatives kind of work. I do want to say that as Chris and I were putting this together, I realized some of my own paradigms and assumptions and how that has influenced the work that we've done in mobile advocacy here at Casa Esperanza, and that all of our advocates are bilingual, bicultural. And so we don't have to coordinate interpreters when we go out and meet with people generally, for example. So those are little pieces that we can dig into later. But generally speaking, mobile advocacy forwards those three objectives. And we can move to the next slide. There are so many things that we can learn when we connect with other people in their homes or in a space where they feel comfortable. So it can really help identify other supports that we can provide that we might not otherwise identify, or a survivor might not raise as an issue, or might not know that we have the resources to help with a specific concern. We can better assess safety risks and provide other mitigating supports for safety and other issues like food or other things that might come up. Just being in someone's home and seeing the photos of their family can help you provide ideas for natural networks of support that they could tap into, for example. So there are lots of reasons why, and Chris can share a little bit more about that.
Okay, next slide, thanks. So Patricia's just given you lots of reasons that mobile advocacy is so effective, but I told you how much I like this approach and just want to outline a few more, kind of some big picture reasons. And the first has to do with access, already mentioned. But we really want to emphasize how vital it is, how vital that is by reminding you of the societal context. How many survivors may not only not know about how to access system support, but may have actually actively avoided systems contact. They've faced systemic racism, they've been re-traumatized when they present in different systems or become entangled with them, or for other reasons. They've just not found systems to be all that helpful. The second reason has to do with trauma and that whole context and wanting to work from a trauma-informed place. We know that when people are coping with trauma, they experience not really having much choice in what has happened to them. So when they have choice and when they have a sense of agency, it's a very helpful piece of trauma recovery. So having more equal footing with how the services get delivered while they're engaged with us in our programs can really help towards trauma recovery. It also, I think, as Patricia mentioned, allows an advocate to have a much more authentic relationship and less role-based. So it's more equal footing, more of a partnership between the advocate and the participant. And the third is about you as an advocate or your program. Mobile advocacy, really being out in the community, allows you to learn so much more and so much in a much more deep kind of way what the resources are like out there. What is the neighborhood that the survivor is living in like? What is close to where that location is? And then in terms of working with systems partners, learning in fine detail how other systems work because you're there in person to see it rather than talking with someone over the phone. Likewise with relationships that you might have with community partners. You get to know each other on a face-to-face, first-name basis, and it really can help deepen those collaborations and partnerships. The next slide, please. This is a great quote. I use it a lot because I love it so much, from one of the advocates in the program that I ran here in the Portland area, where we used mobile advocacy extensively, starting in our housing program, but then moving into every arena of our program because it was such a good way to be making connection with survivors. So our children's advocates went out and did home visits. All the different aspects of our program were using this approach. But this advocate really points out, she was an experienced advocate, I just should tell you, very experienced when she started doing mobile advocacy, but she'd been very shelter-based. So she was really used to that model of she shows up at the shelter and she works with the folks who are there in the house, etc. So mobile advocacy was entirely new to her, but she quickly came to love it. And this is one of her observations about why this approach makes so much sense when we think about the context of survivors' lives. I talked earlier about bad experiences with systems or fear of systems that they've encountered in their lives or in their experience of trying to survive domestic violence or sexual assault. And other systems just don't work this way. So when we show up in this very different way in their lives, it communicates something, that's very unique to a survivor. And I think it can really help open doors and help build trust that doesn't happen in other contexts. And the next slide. So mobile advocacy can take many forms, and here are just some of them. And I really want to invite, I don't think the chat box has been all that active so far. Would love to invite you to type in some of your own examples if you've been using mobile advocacy in your work into the chat box. But mobile advocacy can be what we typically call accompaniment, going together to appointments and to court hearings, sometimes to be there in case active intervention or advocacy, in-person advocacy is needed, sometimes as a support person so that the survivor can really get some help with navigating their way through those systems. Going out and doing an active housing search. This is something that was very key in our use of mobile advocacy in our housing program here in Portland, and actually all the domestic violence programs are doing this now in our community. It can mean really helping somebody get to where they need to go. Transporting is not the main objective of mobile advocacy. It's about contact and access. But transporting might also take the form of riding the bus together to an appointment so that if you're in an urban area that has a bus system, so that the survivor can become more familiar with how to get around on their own. It can mean helping, being right there present to help bridge a language barrier, which has been very, very handy with landlords and other service providers as well. It can also take the form of home visits. But it can also be a meeting at a coffee shop, meeting in a library, going to the survivor's workplace because they can't come to you during the daytime. They don't have the time to be able to do that. So coming during a lunch break and meeting there, whatever is good and convenient and safe for the participant. And it can also really provide that very calming presence, even if active advocacy isn't part of what you're doing when you're kind of roaming around town with someone to help them navigate systems. You can be a very calming presence. Next slide. So just a few things of what mobile advocacy is not. So it's not crisis response. It's not unusual, I want to make sure to say this because it's not unusual for people who are new to this approach to feel hesitant or even fearful. And we'll be discussing safety further a little bit later. But here we just want to be clear that mobile advocacy is not about, you know, strapping on a helmet and body armor and walking into known danger. Mobile advocacy may sometimes follow crisis response. For example, advocates that work closely with law enforcement once a scene is cleared of danger, but it's generally not walking into the fray and entering an active crisis situation. And the second point here is that mobile advocacy is not mandatory. It's not the new way we're going to be doing all of our services. Oops, somebody skipped the slide to the next slide. I'm not there yet. Thanks. As with all of our services, mobile advocacy should be a choice for the survivor. And it's something to add to our range of services, not to replace what we're doing now. It's also not just setting up an outreach office, because that can be a start to get into communities or parts of a rural area where you're cutting down on the need for somebody to find transportation to come into town, for example. But people are still coming to you in an outreach office. So mobile advocacy is really about going out to them. Now we can do the next slide. Okay. I can't help myself. Here are a few more benefits of getting out there in the community. Operating from our confidential locations has really done a lot to put kind of a big cloak over what advocacy is really about. And we discovered when we were out there actively working with community partners in a physically present kind of way, they learned a whole lot more about what an advocate can do, what role they might play, and how they can be helpful in the work that systems partner might be doing. So it puts our act out on the road more and takes that cover of what advocacy really is. off and helps people learn how helpful we are. The face-to-face relationships, I kind of already went over this, really strengthen our ability to have vibrant, effective collaborations and partnerships. And another advantage of it is that it really introduces more variety and fluidity into an advocate's day. So rather than sitting in the same office all day, you're in many different places during a day. And you also get the advantage of having a connection to a bigger picture and helps connect your advocacy to other things that are going on out in the community. Okay. So as I mentioned, mobile advocacy can include visiting survivors where they're living and providing home-based advocacy. This quote illustrates again that it's the survivor's choice and that should be the first consideration. So our advocates experienced that many participants really loved the home visits and really wanted to receive all their services that way. And others maybe were feeling more private about their home space and wanted to meet somewhere close to where they lived, but not in their home itself, so a coffee shop or somewhere else. And then how we do the mobile advocacy, really we're trying to work with a survivor as a whole person as we're out there being more immersed in the survivor's world. We're having a chance to talk more about other things that are going on for the survivor. So this was a housing advocate, and she said, we always talk about rent stuff because that's part of the core of the service they were providing. But they lead the conversations, and they can talk about what's important to them that visit. Next slide. Okay, so let's look for a minute at some of the things to think about, discuss with the survivor, and do ahead of time if home visiting will be part of what you provide or might be part of what you provide, the way you provide advocacy with a particular survivor. So we want, and this is not an all-inclusive list, it's just to kind of get the ball rolling on your thinking. Definitely making sure that it's something the survivor is choosing, talking ahead of time about the purpose of the visit. Some survivors have had systems involvement and they're worried that this is going to be about a home inspection, and you want to make very clear that that's not the purpose of it. You also need to really educate yourself about any cultural considerations that might be part of making that decision about whether or not home visiting is a good way to provide those services and have that contact. Are there cultural reasons to avoid a home visit? Are there cultural reasons that encourage a visit? And one example might be that a male advocate visiting a Muslim female survivor without a male present in the home would really not be culturally appropriate. I also have a great story from an agency in the Seattle-King County area that works with refugees and immigrants, and they cut down on the home visiting that they were doing because they found that culturally for some of the folks that they were providing services to, a home visit meant having lavish food available, everybody dressed in their finery, extended family members there to meet the honored guest, and that it really put a kind of burden on the family that the advocacy really was not all about. So they instead meet with survivors in their offices and try to make it a very culturally comfortable environment for them there. So those are just a couple of examples of cultural considerations. Thinking about the time of day that might be most convenient for survivors to receive a visitor. We don't want to visit at meal times necessarily unless you're going to participate with helping with that perhaps. Kids' bedtimes would not be a good time to try to go. Maybe even right after school lets out would maybe not be a great time. But talking about all this stuff with the survivor ahead of time is important. Who else might be in the home? Privacy is really important when you're providing advocacy services. So Is there a housemate? Is there someone, a new partner, a current partner who might be in the home, and can privacy really be arranged? It may or may not work to do home visits. And then, of course, making sure that you're not scheduling yourself so tightly with all your home visits that you're not allowing for the time that you need to get there and not be stressed out when you arrive. Okay, it's over to Patricia
Great.
now.
Yeah, so Chris covered several things that that should be taken into consideration when deciding whether or not a home visit is appropriate or wanted. And some of those things also are incorporated in what you would do to prepare for a visit when you've decided, yeah, this makes sense for this particular participant at this particular time. And really a lot of the preparation is about having open conversations in advance so that any anticipated concerns can be addressed and discussed and decided upon as best you can before you go. So the participant can review all safety concerns, the advocate can review safety concerns, get a sense of, like Chris was saying, who else is in the home, who's around, what type of house is it? Is it a secure apartment building? Is it a single family home? What kind of situation do you think you'll be walking into? And certainly, especially in the case of domestic violence, where the perpetrator is one of the considerations. So other safety concerns around lethality and those kinds of things you would want to review with a participant before making the decision about whether or not it's appropriate. There are always items that can be brought to the visit, like you know, if the child needs new shoes and there's no way for the survivor to buy shoes, and that's a resource that you can provide, having the opportunity to discuss those ahead of time, you can bring that and then save the trip to going back another day. Making sure you have any of the forms that are needed or anything that would require a signature as much as you could as an advocate, preparing all of those and coming to the visit with those kinds of things. Self-assessment for advocate concerns is something that's really important too. And I think I have this in another slide later, but if the advocate feels fear or concern, it is important to look at that and listen to that and try and unpack that and see if it's something that's about the specific situation, something about something that they read in the ex parte order for protection, what is coming up with any kind of fears or concerns on the part of the advocate, and really working with the supervisor to look at those and address those and create a plan A, B, C for any kind of eventuality. There are ways to create safety protocol with your supervisor or your coworkers. People put their, like general information about where they are in their calendars, for example, and everybody can see their calendars. So not necessarily participant names or addresses, but enough of initials or whatever so that someone could look up, okay, they're at this person's house and this is their address and they're supposed to be back by 3 p.m. And just keeping those lines of communication open with other staff is really helpful. There are, and then in the Learn What You Can in Advance, really speaks to some of those cultural competency and cross-cultural interactions pieces. If you are working with a participant from a cultural group that you're unfamiliar working with, it's important to do some research beforehand, either on your own or with a partner organization that supports a specific cultural community to build capacity to really have a successful interaction. We often provide co-advocacy with other organizations as well where we can team together. If a non-Latino organization is working with a Latino family, we can work together to help meet those needs. there are more safety and other preparation questions later. But during a visit, again, safety is always a concern. And I think one of the things that is kind of a hard truth to think about in this work is that you can't take safety for granted anywhere, even at our own offices. We may have a greater sense of normalcy being at our own offices, but anything can happen at any time. So it is a greater unknown going out into the community and meeting with someone in a location that isn't familiar to the advocate. But that is something that we can't take safety for granted anywhere. There are risks anywhere we're doing this work at any point in time. So it is important for the advocate to arrive centered and prepared to have this open, authentic conversation and interaction with a complete stranger in an unknown place, which is something that's a little bit above and beyond what is asked of in shelter-based advocacy, where advocates can be really comfortable in their own space. Often it's helpful to bring something to share. What Chris said about survivors making food or wanting to serve food. Originally, we Casa Esperanza had ascribed to the never accept gifts kind of approach. You can't accept anything from a survivor, from a participant, and it came really into conflict with this reality that community-based advocacy was something that was important for the organization. So you would go and someone would offer you tea and some cookies, and you had this internal conflict of, do I accept this or not? And I know I'm supposed to be this boundaries person and be professional, but she's offering me tea. And it's important to participate in that interaction, because that's part of the connection building. And in anticipation of that, I have a picture of a Jell-O mold here, and I never have ever brought a Jell-O mold to someone's house, but we recently got a donation of Girl Scout cookies, and bringing a box of cookies with you, or if you have a food pantry and can bring some fresh vegetables, or something that would contribute and kind of offset what you can anticipate as some gesture of welcoming and generosity on the part of the person that you're coming to visit, can offset some of that feeling of tension or awkwardness. At the beginning of the visit, it's important to review all of the safety conversations that you've had. One of those things is talking about who you are and who you should say you are if someone comes in. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Reviewing confidentiality and mandatory reporting is really important, especially being in someone's home. Like Chris said, it's not an inspection, but people can feel judged in a specific way. Having people there, especially if there isn't clarity around what my role is and what I can and can't share and will and won't share with other people. And the orientation to the whole person. I think one of the most important things to think about from a program perspective with mobile advocacy is that it does take more time. You have the travel time, and then you have the making yourself comfortable in someone else's space time. And if you really want to have that authentic connection with someone, there's time for small talk about, oh, that's a really nice set of towels you have in your kitchen. Where'd you get those? And those kinds of things that really just help ease that conversation into a more natural safety planning, goal planning, task-oriented conversation that is advocacy work. And then we can then during the visit discuss leave behinds, next steps, and future communication. It's really important that whatever could be left behind could be found by someone else, even if it's not a partner, but it could be a well-meaning brother or sister or a neighbor that comes and could see your brochure or your business card and see some concern, and then essentially either out the participant as someone who is experiencing violence, or that person could share the concern with the partner, and then the partner would know that you're working together. So being really careful about anything that you leave behind, and preparing the participant for what they might want to do with those documents or that information. Next steps, commitments on either part of what's going to happen. Working outside of a shelter-based environment, you don't have that constant connection with people or that ability to just say hello and how are you doing every day as easily. So making sure that there's clarity around what's going to happen next and what can the survivor expect and what can I as an advocate expect from what our next things are. Future communication is also an important thing to agree upon before leaving. How do you want me to connect with you? Should I wait for your call? Regular things like, is it safe to leave a message? If I don't hear from you in a particular period of time, is there someone you want me to call to be able to connect with you another way? Any of those kinds of conversations will help, again, provide a plan A and a plan B for how to stay connected and be able to continue working together on the participants' goals. And the next slide. After a visit, of course, allowing time to debrief and decompress. I think the don't arrive stressed is a really important one, especially if you schedule multiple meetings in different parts of town during the day. So really scheduling in a way that supports being able to get from point A to point B in a reasonable amount of time, with enough time before and after for the advocate to process what was heard, read any notes that they need to write, any of those kinds of things. Following through on all commitments is really important, again, because participants who are working in the mobile advocacy context won't see you every day. So making sure that if there's a follow-up that needs to be done, that happens, and then it gets communicated back to the participant in the avenues that you've agreed upon is tremendously helpful for being able to maintain that relationship and maintain that connection. And just because it was safe and appropriate to meet someone at their home or in another place once, that doesn't necessarily mean that the next time it will be either safe or welcome or appropriate. So it's important to make sure that you get kind of that affirmative consent from the participant every time, and assess every time that you're considering a visit if anything has changed in their situation that you would need to be aware of to do a different kind of safety planning or a different kind of approach. So again, like there are all kinds of things that you can do to mitigate those kinds of safety concerns, but we can keep talking about that later on because I know that's one of the biggest concerns that people have with this issue.
Okay, Chris again. So Patricia has already named several of these, but we wanted to kind of put them all together because we know that there is a focus sometimes on how to make sure that some of the things that could be not so great about a home visit are thought about ahead of time and planned for. So, survivors, no matter what you tell them, they still may feel the need to clean house for you or to host you in some way. So having that open conversation and transparency around what the expectations are around that is really important in every case, I think. It also sometimes can take a while to learn whether the survivor truly wants you in their space. And one of the things that might possibly happen is that you go all the way across town and you make sure you double check that this time is good and works for the survivor, and then they're not there when you arrive. They might be telling you that, I don't really know how I feel about these home visits. So you can talk about it if it happens or if it doesn't happen. Would you really rather meet at my office? Would you really rather meet in the park down the street from your house, because that would be easy for you to get to? So that, as Patricia said, some of the things that were true for one visit, you may have to check them out again for each visit. It's also Takes a lot of planning ahead because you can't bring all the resources that are available at the office. You can't walk down the hall and make a copy because you don't have a copier in your back pocket. There may be a form that you didn't know to bring because something came up in your conversation that triggers the need for it. So that can mean sometimes just being really creative about how you get things done, either ahead of time or after the visit. If the survivor is in some kind of shared housing, privacy can be tricky. Kids are often very curious and want to be in on the visit. So sometimes you can bring things for kids to get engaged with so that you can figure out how to have a more private conversation with the parent. Some things may come up. I think this is coming up in the chat box. You might see some things when you're more immersed in somebody's life in that real present way that could mean having a hard conversation later. It may mean you see some indication that there's some drug use going on in the apartment, which you know is a lease violation and could end up with some kind of eviction or legal trouble. You may see something that concerns you about the children's welfare in the home. So there might be some things that will require hard conversations later. As Patricia said about safety in general, though, I think that these are conversations that we may have to have with survivors regardless of the setting in which we're working with them. So some of these things can come up in shelter or in other kinds of outreach services. But it's a reality that you might see something that means having a discussion that could be, you know, difficult for both you and the survivor. And then Patricia alluded to this one too. Travel takes more time than for you than meeting at your office. But again, what we're looking at is taking the burden off the survivor and the travel time or the difficult time that they might have with piecing together transportation to your office. So you're taking that burden on. But it does take more time, and you have to build in time around each visit into your day. Okay, the next slide. I love this little turtle. This is awkward. The idea of going to someone's home can just sometimes feel awkward. I'm an introvert, and I feel that sometimes when I go over to friends' homes. But this first quote from a mobile advocate, an experienced mobile advocate, can really take you a long way towards getting more settled with the idea and the whole concept of doing a home visit. I try to think about how I'd want somebody to act in my own home, and then I present that way. So I think it's easy to kind of imagine, and maybe some of us on the webinar have had this experience, a service provider is coming to my home to discuss how things are going. What would I want that visit to be like? And some survivors have had uncomfortable home visits from, say, a child welfare agency and might be concerned that that's what the visit is going to be like. So again, really, really expansive conversation about what home visiting in your context is going to be. But in terms of your own comfort level as an advocate, thinking about what you would like it to be like if somebody were coming to your home. Flexibility is really important, and the second quote speaks to that, and so did Patricia. Sometimes just drink the tea. It could offend somebody, hurt somebody's feelings. If they offer you a cup of tea, you don't want them to be preparing you a lavish meal, and you can certainly have conversation about that. But we can break down some of our preconceptions about what a good advocate does and doesn't do by remembering that this is all about trying to have a more authentic and partnership with a survivor rather than one up, one down, or I'm the service provider, you're the client.
And Chris, can I just add here that...
Yes, I was hoping you would.
Yeah, I was recently in a meeting with someone, and she was really emphatic about how the just the assumption that it's not safe for someone else to go to her home after an incident of domestic violence, like to her felt like layers and layers of judgment, and judgment based on preconception and prejudice that didn't necessarily apply in her situation. So I think some of those paradigms within which we work around safety are, formed from real experience and real concerns and real fears, based on the unpredictability of what can happen in a situation of domestic violence. And that's why mobile advocacy is not always appropriate and not always the best thing. But in situations where you can really assess those concerns, mobile advocacy can be really important, and those upfront conversations that are about this is not a judgment on you or your household, but this is about how are you and I going to work together in a positive way through this situation that you're going through, can really help level that conversation. And if you're feeling like there's the advocate that is operating off of some of these prejudices or concerns, the Cultural Wellness Center out of Minneapolis has some really good resources around practicing self-study in what might be going on for that advocate and where are these fears or concerns coming from and how they can work through them to be able to show up well for people, particularly people who work across different cultural groups.
Thanks, Patricia.
Yeah.
So now, and this is being a very organic conversation, because some of these things we have been kind of touching on or circling around. Sometimes I think the work that we have to do with ourselves to this, when we're thinking about using this model, it involves kind of getting out of our own way just a little bit to become more open to mobile advocacy. And I think that we conceive of safety, how we conceive of safety is really one of those big overarching concepts. We need to stand back from it and critique it a bit, because despite the very early days of our movement that Patricia referred to earlier, the kitchen table, grassroots, pre-funding, women helping women days, one of the primary ways that we began to help survivors was to hide them away in secret locations. So we associate safety with secrecy and hiddenness. And I'm not downplaying the need for that then and now for some survivors. But I do think we also have to consider whether we sometimes see safety too narrowly. The fact that most of the time, except for brief periods when survivors may be in temporary emergency housing in a confidential location, or staying with somebody that the abuser doesn't know about and being hidden in that regard. But most of the time, survivors live out in the world, right? And so we have to help them plan for their safety out in the world and to be in that endeavor with them. Safety planning with them helps us work together safely. Next slide. As advocates, we're amazingly skilled at safety planning. And so, of course, our survivors are amazingly skilled at safety planning. They keep themselves as safe as possible every day. So it makes sense that when we provide more community-based services, we put our heads together and plan around these new contexts. This means looking at possible scenarios you might face that are unlikely to come up if you're in your office or in a shelter. And you may also want to focus in on building some agency or structural supports connected to safety. In fact, I know you should, not you just may want to consider it. You should consider having those structural supports. So safety planning really, every time, no matter where you're meeting with somebody, I think we're used to, even if somebody's coming to our office, talking with them ahead of time about how they can get there safely. So that's already kind of built into the way that we operate. having a plan for what you'll say or do if you encounter the person causing harm, and talking about what's the likelihood that that might happen, so that that can be part of your considerations around where you might meet. How does the survivor want to identify you if someone they know sees you together out there? If you're sitting in McDonald's having coffee together and having your advocacy check-in, and a friend or a relative comes in and recognizes the survivor, what does the survivor want to, how does the survivor want to explain you? And there are different kinds of things like this, this person is helping me out with my kids at school, or with getting books for my kids, or whatever you might, so rehearsing that ahead of time and having a plan for what that's going to look like. Some survivors may say, I want everybody to know that I'm working with you. So they'll introduce you and tell them who you are and that kind of thing. So really having that conversation ahead of time, which is what's true of so many of these aspects around mobile advocacy. Make sure your program knows where you are. You've got some kind of check-in plan before and after a visit, sometimes with an advocate buddy or maybe with a supervisor. And our advocates always felt like the two most important tools in mobile advocacy were your instincts and your cell phone. So making sure you have your cell phone not only with you but charged and having that accessible during the visit.
That's great. And I think, trauma and mobile advocacy are definitely something to talk about. Like Chris said, trust your instincts is really, really important. Especially in situations when I, for example, knew that it was a particularly contentious time leading up to a court hearing or something, I would behave quite a bit differently approaching a survivor's place of residence or wherever we were going to meet. I'd usually circle the block once. I'd usually take stock of entrances and exits. I would be a little more hyper alert, and even if the person had told me, oh, we don't have to worry, I know that my partner is out of town today, those kinds of things. I trust what they tell me, but I also trust my gut in that situation, so that's really important to emphasize with advocates doing this work. Additionally, advocates with past trauma could be triggered at any point in our work generally, and we know that a lot of people who come to this work come from it because of personal experience. So mobile advocacy opens up a whole new set of variables within which advocates who have experienced violence in the past could experience some kind of trigger. So specific types of spaces or buildings or smells could be triggering, and that's where much more close supervision and support and training on the part of the organization can really be helpful to prepare an advocate to be able to identify, okay, I'm walking into this space and I'm feeling extra scared. What might that be about? And be able to put that in a framework that's helpful for the advocate to meet well with the participant and then be able to come back and sort through all of that together. Being in unknown environments can increase the fight, flight, and freeze response for advocates as well. Like I said, if I knew that it was a particularly contentious time, my senses would already be heightened, and we hear that from advocates all the time too. So that experience itself, knowing that you might be in danger, is to some degree vicarious trauma for advocates. So again, I think you have to put it in the context of, we do this work in the context of violence every day, and anything could happen in our offices as well. We just get kind of normalized to what a day in the office looks like. So there's just a different level of care and attention to be put into what happens when advocates are working in a mobile advocacy context. The comments that Chris made about someone recognizes the participant when you're out having a coffee at McDonald's, depending on your particular community and and how visible your organization is in your community, whether it's a rural or urban or in a culturally specific setting, the advocate themselves may be recognized as well as a person who works for the domestic violence program. So that's another thing to consider, and to have that conversation in advance with the participant. Like, I know that I'm well known as an advocate for our organization in the program, and if someone sees us out at the library together, they may make assumptions about what's happening in your life. How do you feel about that? And you know, in culturally specific communities, oftentimes the Latinas who work in our organization in advocacy are really well known in community and really well connected, whereas some of the non-Latina advocates are less well known and less connected. So those conversations can look different depending on the staff, the particular staff that is working with the participant. So it's important to look at those considerations from both the perspective of the advocate and the participant, and how to prepare for that eventuality in doing mobile advocacy.
Patricia's going to go into, in a minute, some of the important organization level considerations in making a shift to a broader use of mobile advocacy. But I'm going to talk for just a minute on the advocate level. Here are a few things to be looking at and thinking about. On this, using this model, you're more on your own. You need to be tapping into your great organizational skills, your time management skills, planning ahead of time and afterwards. You need to be able to know what you can decide on your own when you're out there in the field versus what your agency needs to okay. And you need to plan for getting adequate support in a different kind of way, and that debriefing time in a different kind of way. You can't maybe just walk down the hall and knock on somebody's door and sit down in their chair and debrief if you're out on the road with this model. So you may have to find new and creative ways to maintain that connection to support. Make sure that you've got some time at your home base and a way to make sure that communication is flowing well. Being ready for new experiences, more face-to-face contact with partners in the community requires flexibility and allowing yourself to have a learning curve as you first get out there doing this advocacy differently. It takes a while to kind of get your footing with it, and that's okay. The work is very contextual, and so you need to trust your ability to make good judgments, to find new ways, as I said, to have a sounding board, and learn to trust yourself, which is very different mode of operating sometimes when we work in a context where our coworkers and our supervisors are physically around us all the time. And as we've made really clear, you are much more immersed in the survivor's world, and you're seeing more of their lives. And you're also in a position to work with them as a whole person, not just with their issues stemming from being a survivor. The relationship may be fuller, it may be longer term. Sometimes mobile advocacy and the community advocacy that we've been talking about can take place over a long period of time and not just for a brief period, which is maybe what some of us are used to with the crisis-based work that we've done. And it may require you to be present and to show up kind of in a different way. So it can be demanding emotionally. So you really do need to plan for your self-care and recentering and grounding and all those kinds of things. Relationship-based work can be very, very full and very tapping sometimes, demanding. Tricia?
Yep. So I think the comment that Chris made about, advocates need to be able to make decisions is really pertinent. And one of the ways that's really helpful to mitigate that is to, before even taking on mobile advocacy, if that's where the organization is, or in an ongoing way as an organization already using mobile advocacy, is to develop and maintain a framework for decision making. So All kinds of things come up when you take on the mobile advocacy approach. So when are appointments made, and when can exceptions be made, and how? So that, only during business hours? What if someone works every day and really can only meet on the weekend? How do you have those conversations with staff, and what's the organization's expectation? And what if the advocate really feels compelled to make an exception? How does the initiative really negotiate those things within itself? What happens when appointments run beyond the scheduled time? That can often interfere with others' schedules that you've made, but also that safety planning and communication with your other staff. Like, that could create a crisis at the office if you're just having a great conversation and you run over time and you don't realize all of a sudden people are worried about where you are and if you're okay. And so what happens in that situation? The more relaxed atmosphere, or which can happen in mobile advocacy, can make appointments run a little bit longer. That also has implications for hourly workers if the advocates work on an hourly versus salaried basis. It's important to discuss what's expected of advocates during home visits. Like I said, all kinds of things can come up. Someone with a broken arm could ask the advocate to take out the garbage, and that's, there are lots of conversations to unpack around that. Is that really an advocate's job? Is that, something that we should really ask people to do or be willing to do? So I think, that's a really minor example, but it is something that could happen. And oftentimes those types of incidents, if the advocate is well situated to make that determination on their own and then bring it back to the team and say, well, you'll never guess I was asked to do X, Y, or Z, and this is how I chose to handle it, the rest of the team can learn from that experience as well. And the point wouldn't be to codify whatever decision-making is into a policy, but to really enhance the framework based on the conversation that your team has. How we approach mandatory reporting, again, that's something that you would speak about at the outset with a participant, but the team and the advocates themselves need to have an understanding of, what if you see paraphernalia? What if you see a specific kind of discipline in the home that you may not see out in public, or, those kinds of things that might be concerning or that an advocate may not know what to do with in the moment. The more role-playing and preparation you can do, the better. When is providing transportation appropriate? This is something that comes up a lot with mobile advocacy. Here at Casa Esperanza, we provide transportation all the time to all kinds of things for all kinds of reasons. That has implications in making sure that you have the right types of car seats and that you're prepared to transport a participant and their child. All kinds of things come with that. So those are really important conversations to have ahead of time so that your advocate doesn't go to the appointment with the participant and think, oh, we're just going to be here and talk for an hour, and then say, oh, I really need to get to the doctor's appointment. Can you take me? Because there's a person who has been receptive and responsive and open there. Sometimes it can create expectations that you can just help in any way. And if the program or the initiative isn't okay with transportation, then advocates really need to be prepared for how to navigate those requests. And then are advocates allowed to talk to other family members? A lot of times people have family members who are concerned about what's happening, or the participant doesn't quite know how to explain things, or what's happening with the court proceeding, or whether or not someone's incarcerated. There are all kinds of things that can come up, and this comes out of one experience where I was having a meeting with someone, and the mother-in-law kept calling while we were there, and finally the participant just kind of shoves the phone in my face and says, will you please just talk to her? And we had the conversation already because the mother-in-law had kept calling. Well, what do you want me to say, and why do you want me to talk to her, and how will that be helpful to you? We had that conversation while our meeting kept getting interrupted by these phone calls. So that's one of the ways to work on that confidentiality piece in the moment and say, I can do this for this reason, for this purpose right now, but this isn't my role ongoing, those kinds of things. So it's, being in someone's home or being out and about with people, you can notice and observe things that may seem out of place or may seem weird, and it's important for advocates to be able to reserve judgment until they have more information, because most of the people that we're working with in this situation are, if not an immediate crisis, right, because that's not the purpose of mobile advocacy, but are in a really difficult period of their time of their life. So we don't know what normal looks like, we don't know what abnormal looks like, and it's important to just go and meet someone where they are, literally and figuratively, in this process. We can move to the next slide. And I think you've gotten the sense so far, hopefully, that mobile advocacy requires additional training, mentoring, and support, particularly to be able to work within the emotional context of being with people in their space or in public, dealing with really serious or emotional conversations. Advocates needing the autonomy, and if not autonomy, the consistent access to supervisors for approval during a visit for whatever kinds of things might come up. Opportunities for team consultation among the team, that's mutual learning and mutual decision making sometimes. Technology and equipment, like Chris said, cell phones with internet access, laptops with a hotspot, all kinds of things we found to be helpful with mobile advocacy. And then transportation for the advocate, either with an agency-provided car or advocates using their personal cars, and having conversations with your organization about whatever implications those would be. And that also includes the organization needing to be able to provide car seats if necessary. In the next slide, this also means that we have to set realistic expectations. So if you had a grant proposal and you thought, we're going to be able to serve 100 people, and you didn't realize that these mobile advocacy approaches would take 3 or 4 hours per visit, that may decrease the overall number of people that you can see. So it's important to take into consideration the realities of this approach if you are making commitments around how many people that would be and how many participants an advocate gets assigned to work with. The landscape definitely shapes our services and our experiences as advocates working in community. So whether it's rural or urban or tribal or frontier, all of those realities really inform how you would look at making this approach work for the organization and making the approach work in any particular survivor situation. Again, looking at cultural norms, understanding your own and learning about others, and the ultimate mobile advocacy reality, which is flexibility, because it's just a constant learning process. There is a lot of evidence around mobile advocacy, like I alluded to in the beginning. Promotoras have had, we can move to the next slide, promotoras have had a lot of success in, like I said, training lay people to provide supports and services and information, also as a way to create access to highly skilled professionals as well, with all kinds of great benefits in the community and in different public health issues. Our particular evidence base at Casa Esperanza started with listening sessions conducted in 1998 that really transformed our organization and really lifted to the surface that Latinas did not want to leave their relationships to get support around violence. They just wanted the violence to stop. So if shelter at the time was our only solution was not going to address that concern that we heard coming out of community. And that's part of why Casa Esperanza has been doing community-based or roving or mobile advocacy for so long. Other priorities often take precedence over domestic violence, and being available to be present in different realms in a participant's life can help really address some of those other issues and still support the domestic violence or sexual assault concerns. And Latinas wanted greater access to information and resources, and part of that had to do, especially at the time, with transportation barriers and lack of access to internet. So as times have changed, we've adapted our approaches to that reality. But all of those, every time we do listening sessions, all of these concerns are still lifted up and still inform the work that we do and still tell us that mobile advocacy is highly relevant to the work that we're doing. One important thing to note about the base of evidence and current trends, we can move to the next slide, is that in this current socio-political climate, things that are happening are influencing help-seeking behaviors, particularly in immigrant communities or other marginalized groups. The willingness to call the police in African-American communities or in immigrant communities is heavily impacted by bigger picture issues that are happening around, gun violence and police gun violence and other immigration-related concerns. So some of these things are already being documented, but again, especially in this context for specific cultural communities, making advocacy available in different ways can really help mitigate some of those fears and concerns that are coming up in communities.
Okay. This is a very wordy slide that I'm going to encourage you to read on your own, but let it suffice to say that there are evaluations and research projects that are really validating the efficacy of mobile advocacy, and we have a gut sense of how effective it is. We have the listening sessions that Patricia just spoke about, but we also have some actual data-based research that shows that mobile advocacy is a really effective way to provide services. So there are a few of the research studies that you can refer to and learn more about through the next slide. I'm noticing that we're running very low on time for Q&A, so I'm going to go quickly to this as a resource, safehousingpartnerships.org. Some of the things that we've talked about today, many of the things that we've talked about today are things you can find out more information about through this website. It is the website for the consortium that I spoke of way back early in today's presentation. The consortium consists of 4 technical assistance providers that our federal partners have pulled together to work on a range of different issues at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence. So that includes NASH, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, Collaborative Solutions, which has been a HUD TA provider for a very long time and has really helped us bridge to the homeless housing field, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So this is the website of the consortium, and there's a ton of resources that you can access there, as well as making direct requests for technical assistance to be contacted by one of our consortium members to find out more about what your concern is. And we have not much time for questions, but I will pick off one from the start. And the one that I see in the chat box is, would you recommend conducting mobile advocacy with another coworker at first? And I think that that is a fine idea, and in fact sometimes can become the model. One example would be to have a mobile advocate who is there primarily to work with the adult survivor, and another who's there to work with the children or to hang out with the kids during that visit. And so that can be a really effective pairing of advocates for a visit. But also when it's a new model, I think being able to go along with somebody who's experienced at mobile advocacy can really help provide a lot of training and a chance to reflect on how that approach is working for that advocate, that new advocate. We did have an example of some advocates who worked with our local law enforcement here who would respond after the police had made sure that the situation was secure and safe. And we decided that there were 2 of them. We would team them up. It was the middle of the night when they were working. And after doing that for about a month, they came in and said, do you think we could split up now so that we could respond to more situations? And so it really was a good experience for them to kind of get grounded in the model, and then they felt much more confident about working separately. So yeah, I think that's a fine way to help people who have not had much experience with mobile advocacy become more grounded in how to do it. And Peg, are there other questions that you want to aim at us? Okay, Peg must still be having sound issues. How about this one, Patricia? What are some good, safe public places to meet with survivors in your experience?
Libraries, we have found, is always are often helpful. Often they have little private conference rooms where you can meet. Plenty of resources for the kids to play with. They're quiet, and often you can find a little spot where you have a little more privacy than you would, say, at McDonald's having your cup of coffee. We've also been able to have conversations at schools. So if there's a partner school that you've been working with and the social worker has, offered to connect a parent to the organization, we can meet in a room at the school somewhere where there can be privacy provided. It's also a great way to utilize partner organizations. Like we mentioned in the beginning, it's not about necessarily creating an outreach office, but you can utilize the outreach offices for a jumping off point. So that's not really answering the question, but if there's another partner organization nearby, sometimes you can utilize another person's space, another domestic violence organization space, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the chat box, and I'm thinking that we've kind of in the course of our presentation addressed some of the ones that got asked. There's one about what happens if somebody the survivor knows shows up. I think we've addressed that.
And that's because
doesn't it violate
comment earlier too, that
that
the advocate is known certainly influences whether or not this is a useful model for your initiative or for the survivors in your community.
Okay. Does it violate a survivor's confidentiality to meet with them in public? How do you make sure their confidentiality is protected? I guess we've spoken to that in some ways. In my mind, that is a really important part of the conversation that you have with survivors while you're figuring out where the best meeting place is, especially if you're known in the community as a domestic violence advocate. But what we're also wanting to do is have survivors have some agency and some choice in this way of connecting with them. So if a survivor, in considering the confidentiality issues or the privacy issues, says, no, I want you to come to my apartment, that's going to be the easiest and best way for me to have contact with you, then you're talking about, how are you going to describe me, explain me to your neighbors, or what if somebody sees me? You're having those conversations, but really this is about, the survivor being able to kind of make a call about whether that is going to be safe for them. And the other aspect of confidentiality is that can somebody overhear the conversation? And so that's where you're very careful about where you place yourself. If you're meeting in a park, that you're sitting on a bench that is not right near the softball field where people are going to be walking by all the time, so that you can assure that you've got some privacy around the conversation that you're going to be having. Sorry, Patricia, you were going to say something too.
No, that's fine. And one of the things that I really like about being able to have these conversations is that it really opens up a lot of space for survivors to identify where they feel most comfortable, whether that's in the library or at McDonald's or at church or, at school or any of the other places that someone might identify. And more often than not, it's a place that we wouldn't necessarily even conjure up ourselves, right? So I think the strategy really is about, leaving some of those ideas up to the survivor, making suggestions, and allowing the survivor to think through where they naturally feel comfortable and safe, and then talk through that safety planning conversation. Okay, is it likely that we would be interrupted? Is it likely that someone would overhear? When you're meeting at home, it's important to ask, is there potential for any recording devices maybe at your home, anything like that? There are all kinds of little nuancy things that you could always talk about, but the important thing is really allowing the survivor to begin to identify the spaces where they feel safe and supported.
And in our community, McDonald's was a really popular spot because they have a play area. So the survivor can watch the kids, but have some separation from them while sitting there in McDonald's with their advocate. So yeah, there's a range of different ideas that we can come up with together.
Yep.
And I think we are close to the end of our time. I do want to make sure, I saw this get typed into the chat box, that folks who have participated on the webinar today know that we're doing two what we call deep dives, which is a chance for a smaller number of people usually to be on the call with us and actually to hopefully get on camera, because it's a web-based interaction where we can have deeper conversation about these issues and maybe talk more specifically about things that you're encountering or concerns that you have or successes that you've had in your use of mobile advocacy services. We'd love to have a chance to sit down with some of you or all of you again and talk more deeply about these issues. So they're coming up. There's one next week and one the following week, and I think we'll be sending out information about the particulars and how you would register for those in the follow-up that you'll get today following the webinar's completion. Thank you, Patricia. It's been wonderful working with you, and thank you, everybody, for coming. And Jenny, I'm going to let you take us home. Oh, maybe Jenny's having some issues too.
I was muted there too.
Okay.
So yeah, I just want to say thanks again, Patricia, Chris, and Peg, for your presentation today and for fielding the questions in our chat. And